poverty, climate mitigation and adaptation, and gender inequality. So I just wanted, on a more personal note, I've known Bill for a while. He was part of American Energy Innovation Council, which had 7 members, Bill, Norm Augustine, other legendary people, and they wrote something in 2010 called the Business Plan for America's Energy Future. And they had about 6 recommendations. The most important recommendation was they wanted to increase RPE funding, which at that time was funded at $200 million, and said, no, make it $1 billion. I fully agree with that recommendation. And $16 billion a year on clean energy. So, and in 2012, he agreed to come to an RPE summit, and I interviewed him, so to speak, for about 45 minutes. Now, in 2015, he founded, with some of his like-minded friends, a new venture fund called Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And it's to really get access, cheaper energy, to really develop and deploy breakthrough energy technologies that reduce greenhouse gases, but also generating financial return. And many of the early employees were from the DOE, especially RPE. Dozens from RPE, which shows how good those employees at the Department of Energy were and how good the taste of BEV was. And so I just want to close by saying I've long admired Bill for a number of reasons, but mostly for his commitment to changing the world for the better, and for his really insatiable and wide-ranging intellect that I've gotten to know. So with that, Peggy, do you come out? Bill comes out. Great. See how unscripted I am. Anyway, so with that, I give you Bill Gates.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to see the large group here working on how science can improve the world. I wanted to talk a little bit at first about a special topic, which is this recent coronavirus, COVID-19 epidemic. This is a huge challenge. We've always known that the potential for either a naturally caused or intentionally caused pandemic is one of the few things that could disrupt health systems, economies, and cause more than 10 million excess deaths. And there's a lot we don't know about this current epidemic, but there's a lot that we do know that shows that this could be, particularly if it spreads to areas like sub-Saharan Africa and southern Asia, it could be very, very dramatic. We're on the cusp in science of being able to make good tools to do the diagnosis, to provide vaccines, to provide therapeutics, including antivirals. So our foundation is very engaged in terms of the relationships we have with governments in the private sector to orchestrate and provide resources and hopefully contain this epidemic. For anyone who's concerned about that, I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the Q&A, but it's a potentially very bad situation. Well, you're here in Seattle, which is the city I grew up in, as you heard, and just a few blocks from here are the headquarters of the Gates Foundation, and that goes back to the year 2000. In fact, Melinda and I just earlier this week wrote our annual letter talking about the progress, and in this case, particularly talking about the first 20 years. Right from the beginning, we chose the focus to be eliminating inequities, particularly in health in developing countries. We thought that we could make a huge difference, both in the R&D priorities and in the delivery systems to make sure the latest medicines were getting out to all the children in the world. And this work has been very gratifying. It's been very successful. And in fact, today I want to talk about some things that we're just on the verge of being able to do that will help us advance that mission very, very dramatically. The goal being that a child born anywhere has a very low chance of being malnourished or dying below the age of 5, and that these big infectious diseases like HIV, TB, and malaria, that we believe those can largely be eradicated. You know, over these 20 years, the child mortality overall is down by a factor of 2, and you can see that in the chart that's in the middle of that slide. In 1990, it's over 12 million children are dying under the age of 5, and most recently, it's about 5 million. We should be able to cut that in half again. That is, with some of the science advances I'll talk about, we're not done in terms of the fastest reduction ever in those numbers. And if we go 2 more factors of 2, then you basically achieved health equity. That is, you're down to about 1% of children dying before the age of 5 everywhere in the world. In addition to those deaths, another tragedy that isn't talked about to the same degree, but is, if anything, more impactful, and that is that nearly 250 million of children are malnourished. And what that means is that they never achieve full physical or mental development. And both for them individually and for the countries they live in, this is a huge problem, and one that has definitely been under researched. So to get to this health equity, of course, science is where we start. We need governments to fund basic sciences. We need lots of partners that nurture the ideas and are willing to take big risks, not only on specific tools, but on platforms that would allow this work to go faster and develop very, very low-cost products. We also have to understand that the health systems in these countries have very limited capabilities. So anything we do that requires a doctor, that's not going to scale to reach the entire world. So, it's got to be super low cost, easy delivery, very little training involved. But it does represent an opportunity. These developing countries are where the population growth is taking place. It's where the economic growth is taking place. By 2050, sub-Saharan Africa will be over 2 billion people. And that's more than twice the people in Europe and North America. So there's a lot of reasons to care about Africa. Today, most investments in health R&D are really focused almost entirely on the rich countries, and in some cases, because of pricing models, only on the United States. And this is causing the priorities of what gets done and the requirement that it be simple and low cost to be missed, and therefore we're not taking the best of science and creating something that can have its potential impact. And so a redirection either of the market signals or the role of governments and philanthropy or scientists themselves against this broader goal would help us make far greater progress, even more than we have today. We have an opportunity with the advance of tools like artificial intelligence and gene-based editing technologies to build this new generation of health solutions so that they are available to everyone on the planet. And I'm very excited about this. The rate of progress will be faster the number of people who care about this or engaged in this, partly because of the success of these last 20 years. I feel there's real momentum and some of these challenges can be solved. I grew up, as was mentioned, going to a private school here called Lakeside, and that's where I first had the opportunity to use a computer. At the time, it was a computer that was connected over a phone line, very expensive, a little bit confusing, and so the teachers all kind of gave up, and a few students persevered, including myself and Paul Allen. And so, we sort of got addicted. We fell in love with this messing around with this computer, trying to get it to do things. Even in those days, the vision of what computing could do was very expansive. In fact, down at the Stanford Research Institute, in 1968, they actually built Shaky the mobile robot. It was able to move around, lift blocks, it had vision. It's kind of funny today that we're still on the verge of, will there be this type of self-propelling robot? Are there applications that it will be effective in? I was meeting with a number of startup companies this morning, still trying to crack that market. So it proves that although science goes very quickly, sometimes the challenges we take on are very difficult. The Shaky could see those blocks, but of course that was a very self-contained, well-defined environment that it was able to operate in. A lot of this AI work and the ultimate dream of software goes back all the way to 1950 when Alan Turing created the idea that we should be able to match human capabilities in many ways. And AI has gone through a number of boom and bust cycles since then. You'd have to say we're in a boom cycle right now, although there's some very profound things like being able to read and understand text and material like a human does that we actually have no idea how to solve that problem. And it's sort of the next on the agenda and very hard to predict when we'll get there. Even so, the machine learning tools that we have today are going to be applied in a broad range of domains, including modeling disease, finding drugs for disease, understanding biological systems, and so it is a very exciting time. The capacity to execute those AI models is doubling more than once a year. So we're going up even faster than so-called Moore's Law by building these very special purpose things to execute both the creation of deep learning models and the execution of those models. And so applying those in a broad way and really understanding where they're applicable, that data revolution is here today, and it's suffusing itself through many problems, including these health problems that are so critical. We also have recent breakthroughs like the gene editing technologies, including CRISPR. And so, we should be able to use that for very low cost, point of care precision diagnostics. We should be able to use that for therapeutics. And we should gain understandings of how to do vaccines, even vaccines that the turnaround time, instead of being the typical 3 or 4 years, literally at some point we'd be able to create in months. And we want to use these tools not just for orphan diseases or not just for diseases in rich countries, but also for the diseases that predominantly afflict people in the countries where most of humanity lives in, the middle income and the low income countries. In terms of genetics, I'm sure we've all read the history, going back to when people didn't know, Pauling didn't know where is that information encoded. Crick, Watson, and Franklin laid the foundation for modern genetics by understanding how DNA encoded that information. And it's only 15 years ago that the Human Genome Project gave us the basic blueprint and let us now identify sequences that are associated with different diseases. It was 8 years ago that CRISPR came along, and it continues to evolve in some pretty fantastic ways, including the accuracy of the editing. Today, over 89% of genetic variants that we know are associated with human disease can be corrected. That is, if you get into the cells of interest, you can make those corrections. Last year, human trials using these molecular scissors of CRISPR did start to do things like solve sickle cell disease. So we're really on the verge of a direct human benefit. So these are just two examples of powerful tools that we can apply in a narrow sense or in a very broad sense to improve the human condition. I want to give you some other examples and talk about how you actually get from these great new tools all the way out to things like reducing malaria deaths. One partnership that we've initiated recently is one with the NIH to go and develop very low-cost gene editing tools with two particular goals in mind. One is sickle cell disease, and the second is an HIV cure. And we believe that over the next decade, we will be able to make this breakthrough. And that's super critical, because if you take the 38 million people worldwide living with HIV, 95% of them live in low-income countries. And the current treatment regime, although it's brought deaths down from the peak, the ongoing cost and difficulty of that are very hard to sustain, including when you face drug resistance. And even so, with that system, it's imperfect enough that we still have over 1 million people a year who die, and some negative effects even when they're on ARVs. So, the imperative to end that and to have a cure is very, very high. Sickle cell disease is another disease that's far, far more prevalent in low-income countries, particularly in Africa. 15 million babies will be born with sickle cell disease in the next 30 years. And the exact outcomes for those kids in terms of what their life expectancy actually isn't tracked very well, because the diagnostics just recently have gotten cheap enough, and some of the therapies that can help extend their life have gotten good enough, and enough progress has been made on the other diseases, that this is now a big enough part of that childhood death rate, particularly in places like Nigeria, that it is a priority, and now the R&D is being applied. But today, we believe that over 90% of the children born with sickle cell do not survive until their 5th birthday. These ongoing trials that are using the expensive approaches are very, very promising, but we probably know those things today because of the ex vivo approach they use. Those are over $1 million. And the equipment and the doctors and things that are involved in executing those procedures definitely keep them out of the broad low-income country usage. And so the goal here is to not have the typical multi-decade lag between when a breakthrough is available in, say, the United States and when it gets out broadly to help anyone. The goal here is to shorten that, if possible, to well less than a decade. The vision is to have in vivo gene editing techniques that you just do a single injection using vectors that target and edit these blood-forming cells, which are down in the bone marrow, with very high efficiency and very few off-target edits. And that's the vision of how you could literally get out and save all of those lives and bring this incredible disease burden to an end. Similarly with HIV, the goal of the collaboration is to investigate in vivo gene editing that could drive a functional cure for all of those 38 million people who are infected. Again, it's a high bar in terms of how simple and how low cost and how rare the side effects would have to be. But we do believe that it's possible. Amazingly, gene editing is also the most exciting tool for us for the work we do in malaria. Malaria, you probably know, it's gone from 1 million deaths a year, mostly young children in Africa now, down to about 400,000. But it's a very difficult disease to bring down from that level. There's outside biting, there's drug resistance. It's very, very difficult. Here, the idea is instead of editing human genetics, it's to use CRISPR to create what are called gene drives. That is a gene which is inherited by all the offspring. If one of the two parents has this particular mechanism, then all of the offspring that has a parent with this, it's driven into the progeny. And so we're working on genes that either reduce mosquito populations or eliminate the Anopheles mosquitoes, which are a very small portion of all mosquitoes, but those are the ones that carry malaria. And if you could change their gut structure a little bit, then the parasite would not be able to burrow through their stomach back into their salivary gland, which is part of how that cycle of infection is completed. Another area, and this is a very broad area, where we need much deeper understandings is in newborn health. Here I've split all these deaths of children under 5 into 2 different categories. You have neonatal deaths in orange there, and you have the postneonatal, that is after the first month of life, on the right. And what you'll see is, it's amazing that almost half the deaths are in those first 28 days. In fact, in a region where you don't have malaria, it is already over half of the deaths are in the first 28 days. And so the progress we've made, particularly against respiratory disease, diarrheal disease, and malaria, that has been in that 1 to 60 month category. So we're really, full speed ahead with lots of new things on the way for that blue area. But in that orange area, you'd be stunned how little we know. Most of those deaths are done. There hasn't been in the past any type of autopsy. And so you just do what's called a verbal autopsy, where you have various symptoms. And so since we don't know the root cause, either of the prematurity that's responsible for some of that, or low birth weight, or those early conditions, until we actually understand that, coming up with the new interventions is going to be very difficult. This is an area where the sensors and tools have gotten so good that we can create, even for births in low-income countries, really large data sets where we're doing ultrasound on the mother and taking blood samples during pregnancy, things where we take biological samples of the baby and really try to understand what the pathogen there is. And as we gather that data, which the ultrasound and other low-cost wearable sensors are making very cheap, and we apply the AI to identify those factors, even in some cases identify them in advance for a particular pregnancy so that we can come up with the right intervention, we think we can have a big impact here. We are seeing more and more incredible links between maternal undernutrition, the maternal microbiome, and premature birth. And by looking at these abnormal states of the microbiome during pregnancy, we may be able to give pregnant women microbial therapeutics, as well as nutritional interventions that improve fetal growth and reduce the risk of stillbirth or preterm or low birth weight fairly dramatically. Another area that was not a priority in science, but now with these new tools and the right types of grants is coming in, and the improvement in the human condition that will come out of that is extremely high. The microbiome is also the key to the optimism we have about reducing malnutrition. I mentioned how widespread that is, and how in terms of even more than those deaths, reducing the quality of life, this is a very dramatic thing. Even if all you care about is deaths, it turns out it's these malnourished kids that are so fragile that when they get diarrheal or malaria or pneumonia events, they're the ones who are likely to die. The kids who are on their growth path, whose weight and nutritional status and therefore immune status is strong, are far less likely to die. So if you want to deal with those further reductions, a solution for malnutrition would help the survival rate dramatically, but even more importantly, it would improve the quality of life for that individual, where they would achieve full mental and physical development. We are now starting to understand these microbiomes, and we are seeing there are substantial differences that explain the growth altering. And so now we have trials out to look at various interventions, some which appear that they might be low cost. The understanding of the microbiome is not just relevant in these poor countries. In fact, there's evidence in wealthy countries that the super hygienic environments we have, an abundance of processed foods, antibiotics, they lead to a microbiome imbalance that makes kids in richer countries more susceptible to obesity, diabetes, allergies, and probably autoimmune diseases as well. And so, I'm sure you see all these startup companies looking at microbiome interventions, even for diseases where you wouldn't naturally think, like neurological disease, where there is, in fact, a correlation. Whether people will map that into causation is yet to be proven, but this is a very exciting area. And this is an area that needed these sequencing tools and the high-scale data processing, including AI, to be able to find the patterns. There's just too much going on there if you had to do it, say, with paper and pencil, to understand the 100 trillion organisms and the large amount of genetic material there. And so, this is a fantastic application for the latest AI technology. Another new approach that the Foundation is very enthused about is the organ on a chip. And in simple terms, the technology allows in vitro modeling of human organisms in a way that mimics how they work in the human body. There's some degree of simplification. Most of these systems are single organ systems. They don't recapitulate everything, but some of the key elements we do see there, and including some of the disease states. So, for example, with the intestine, the liver, the kidney, it lets us understand drug kinetics and drug activity. We also are culturing a human intestinal microbiome on a chip that will let us understand the interactions between microbiome, nutrients, and pathogens in a systematic way. Another area that looks to have promise is the vaginal microbiome. It's pretty clear that an imbalance there dramatically increases the risk of HIV acquisition, and that because that's very prevalent in Africa, that's part of the explanation of why the disease spreads in large numbers there and less so in other locations. And so the question is, can you intervene in a way that changes that risk? Another organ on a chip that's very promising for us is the lymphoid organoids to understand vaccine responses. Could let us develop vaccines far faster and understand things like adjuvants that are very critical for a lot of the new vaccines we're working on. Well, another area that I wanted to mention is the connection between climate change and health. Climate change rightly is getting a lot of focus, but the richness of how we go about minimizing the damage and reducing those greenhouse gases, certainly you wouldn't say that we have a plan. The term for the reduction of the gases is mitigation, and the term for minimizing the negative effects is adaptation. Adaptation, that is helping people deal with climate change, hasn't got nearly as much attention. And that's partly because the vast portion of the suffering that will be caused is for subsistence farmers near equatorial regions. And so you have this mismatch where the place where the money and science are and the place where the historical emissions are is almost entirely separate from where most of the suffering will be. As you get more extreme weather conditions, floods, droughts, you get more pests and disease, and it means the percentage of years where your crop almost entirely fails will go up very substantially. And of course, then that means those kids, the rates of malnutrition can go up even higher. And as I mentioned, that very directly connects to the survival rates and the ability of those people to achieve their potential, to be educated and get that country out of the cycle of poverty and move beyond it. And so, in a lot of ways, because of these complex dynamics, the impacts of climate change for the poor countries really aren't being talked enough about and elucidated as much as they should. Now, there are potential scientific innovations here. Historically, the Green Revolution was fantastic with the cereal crops in terms of avoiding widespread malnutrition that many scientists predicted. The groups that do that research are called the CJIR, and they're around, not as well funded as they should be, but it is possible using their technologies to deal with heat, deal with salinity, deal with drought, deal with flooding. There's some very good examples of that. For example, a rice called scuba rice that can withstand flooding. It's almost magical because the previous rice varieties would die if there was excess rain. We also have a team at the University of Cambridge that's using evolutionary genetics to help maize and other cereal crops deal with microorganisms in the soil to capture nutrients and waters. And what that means is if you're a farmer without access to extra inputs, including fertilizer, these seeds will be extremely productive relative to the ones that you've had today. It's like a second generation of the Green Revolution, but understanding the shortcomings of the first and dealing now with the negative effects of climate change as we have a chance to more than double the productivity of those crops, which means that even if you're having some tough years, your ability to maintain a buffer stock and not suffer from malnutrition would be greatly improved. As I said, our foundation has been 20 years at work, and we still have many challenges. Our focus here in the United States is the quality of the education system, both K through 12 and post-secondary. And that's an area where the importance is clear, and so we're very dedicated to that. But the rate of improvement, there's no equivalent to, say, cutting that under 5 death rate, although there is a lot of promise at small scale in terms of making education better. The thing that our education work and health work have in common is they're focused on equity. Healthier and more equal world, I think, is something that we should accelerate. Disease is not only a symptom of inequality, but it's a huge cause. And likewise, low quality public education drives inequality. When we first started our foundation, we were very optimistic about the power of innovation. I had the experience from Microsoft where that all went well. And looking at the global health work, that optimism really has been borne out. And if anything, I see that innovation accelerating. So I think this goal of giving every person the opportunity to live a healthy, productive life is achievable with great science. Thank you.
chair of the board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I have the rare pleasure of having a few moments to chat with Bill Gates after that remarkable speech. You know, really, you covered so much ground and addressed so many important issues and managed to, you know, synthesize cutting-edge science with some of the biggest problems before us and some of the really most powerful and poignant issues in our world, you know, addressing poverty. You may not know this, but you and I were in the same college class. The only difference is that I actually graduated. But listening to you, I would swear you've gone to medical school. I mean, it's remarkable, the depth and breadth of your knowledge. And, you know, you closed your remarks talking about the other part of your foundation, K through 12 education. AAAS has been dedicated for a long time to improving science education. I'm just curious if you have any reflections on how we actually can do better. You know, here we are, you know, as rich as we are and as accomplished as a nation, and yet I think we keep dropping in terms of our standing amongst wealthy nations in terms of performance of our kids in science and math. But do you have some reflections on?
Well, certainly, if you ever get discouraged about U.S. education, you can go into some public schools and some charter schools, and when they have, you know, a group of teachers and the right culture, often long school day, long school year, a way of engaging the parents, a way of making the classes very interactive, you can see magical things. Places like High Tech High down in San Diego or various KIPP charters. There's a Summit School 2 miles from here that has, you know, all very low-income parents, but it's an amazing school. So every time you see that microcosm, you think, wow, why can't we scale this up to the 50 million K through 12 students? And why, as you said, the U.S. educational results are only a tiny bit improved over the last 20 years. The percentage of resources we put into it are increased quite a bit. The relative strength of other countries, including most notably China, you know, they've soared way ahead of us. Even Vietnam now, which is a fairly poor country, has these fantastic educational results. It isn't like a typical science though. If you say, hey, here's two curriculums, say, you know, physics A and physics B, the ability to control for the way it's taught and which students are there and really say, is this one better? And then engage in constant improvement. That framework doesn't exist. And so even for the curriculum piece that is subject to this fixed cost of R&D and low cost of replication, kind of like software or medicine, where you'd think we'd be doing fantastic things, that has not yet taken place. And partly because people don't agree on the goals, partly because it's hard to do right. It's kind of like the steam engine before they could measure the output. Once they got the calorimeter to really say, okay, here's the output, then they did 100 little tweaks and over time doubled the capacity. And so I still feel that we create the right framework for continuous progress in teacher training and in the curriculum and in the various online tools that can engage the child. It's not, you know, people thought, okay, we'll put stuff online, but online doesn't solve the problem, that it's all about motivation. We've had, you know, if you want to learn physics, fine. Feynman wrote a book, sit down, read it. You know, if you're a highly motivated student, believe me, the bits are there. So motivation is the key thing, not how do you make it interesting. And, you know, if somebody's confused or they don't have confidence, how do you keep them engaged? And there is some great work about persistence and how you encourage persistence, but you know, the progress there, contrary to what we assumed, is quite quite modest for the field as a whole, not just our foundation.
We have to figure out how every student can have the Rocky the Robot moment or whatever that sparked your interest in computer science and all the rest. Let me also now go back, though, to another aspect of your presentation where you started coronavirus, because that is something that very much is on the minds of people today. And we had a good session this morning on coronavirus with Scott Dowell from your foundation presenting. And you actually have written so thoughtfully on both natural and intentional biological threats and the catastrophic risk that they pose. But we see these continuous sort of cycles of crisis, concern, and then complacency. And I, you've been in this business now a while, watching various epidemics and epidemic threats, SARS, Ebola, the 2009 H1N1, now coronavirus. And, you and your foundation, have stepped up to the plate also with the current investment you're making of $100 million to help make sure that there's adequate preparedness and response capacity in some critical parts of the world and on some critical aspects of response. But, how is there anything that this current outbreak is making you rethink about how to do some of the R&D investment and the planning? How can we really start to think about creating a sustainable preparedness approach as opposed to these sort of one-off, we'll throw things at this problem and try to, muddle through, and then maybe some lessons learned. Each time we get a little better, I think, but you're sort of a systems kind of guy. Surely we can apply systems thinking and harness advances in science and technology and understanding not just about what's needed from science, but also how to apply it.
Well, certainly the good news is that just the plain old horizontal advance in how we make these tools will help us. That is, molecular diagnostics, those machines are getting cheaper. We have a plan independent of epidemics to get those machines to be fairly pervasive in developing countries. And those are such that even with a few weeks' time, when a new disease shows up, you can come up with the appropriate probes and data and then be able to do large-scale testing. So within a decade, the capacity to create diagnostics capability, we will be better off because we need that for the normal case. It's not going to be financed by some pandemic fund. The ability to create vaccines, there's a variety of techniques, RNA, DNA, and other techniques that are coming along. People like CureVac and Moderna who are looking at the coronavirus and other of these types of pathogens. Those aren't the only companies. But, so that should help. There's been a huge underinvestment in therapeutics, particularly antivirals. I think once we get past this, and hopefully that's not too long from now, I do think that's something China may step up and others will realize there's been an underinvestment there. If the same disease comes along many times, like Ebola, we're actually going to do a decent job the next time Ebola comes along. We have diagnostics, we have therapeutic, we have a vaccine, and I was just seeing a presentation by some modelers yesterday, the understanding of how you engage a community. In that case, being willing to go to the health facilities when you're sick and being able to make sure that self-burial practices are followed. Unlike coronavirus, where you're infectious earlier in your disease, so you could be on a plane or bus or in a store and infect lots of people. Ebola, the good news about it is that you're not very infectious until you're incredibly sick. So it's mostly caretakers or people who touch your body at a funeral who get infected and then maybe take it to another location. So Ebola's, the spread rates of these diseases and the nature of when they're infectious means that they are many orders of magnitude different. You know, Ebola is terrible, but it's not like a 1918 flu. And you know, in the paper I wrote for the New England Journal of Medicine or the TED Talk, I used flu because it was the most identifiable thing. Weirdly, this coronavirus has a lot of similarities to a very bad flu. You know, so far probably more like the 1957 in terms of the death rate and the spread rate. So way worse than a typical seasonal flu, and of course we have no immunity to this of any kind. So, you know, will this get into Africa or not? And if so, will those health systems be overwhelmed? In the case of Ebola, it was, not the DRC outbreak, but the one before that in Western Africa, most of the deaths were caused, the excess deaths, because the health system was shut down and the health workers weren't there. So it was delivery deaths, malaria deaths, pneumonia deaths. Even more, Ebola was directly about 10,000 out of 50,000 excess deaths in 3 countries with a total population of 30 million. And so it's not just that direct effect, it's also, you know, the panic, the overload, things that infect health workers reduce your already very limited capacity. And so this disease, if it's in Africa, is more dramatic than if it's in China. And I'm not trying to minimize what's going on in China in any way.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that we know how quickly healthcare systems, even in this country, can get overwhelmed in a bad flu season, et cetera. So it's easy to imagine the situation you talk about in Africa. You know, I was so struck in your presentation about the commitment to really provide access to important innovations where they're needed, and talking about treatments for sickle cell and HIV, where right now we're anticipating, as we look at gene editing and sickle cell treatments, that they're going to be very, very costly drugs. People are worried about how we're going to pay for them in this country, and you know, you are an optimist in terms of the ability to actually go between your current solution and your future solution on this slide. You know, again, I love your optimism. How doable do you really think that is, near term, long term, and is it going to be sort of rethinking the paradigm, better application of science and technology, some combination of both, and of course, will there be this, you know, sort of sustained investment and attention to the problem to really realize the goal?
Yeah, the disparity is that for many things, the capitalistic profit incentive and the actual human need for some innovation, those are very closely aligned. In the case of diseases in poor country, take, you know, malaria as an extreme example, the families who have children dying of malaria essentially have no voice in the marketplace because they have no money and their government doesn't have either the research capacity or the money to cause those things to be done. So we do see this mismatch. Now, historically, if you had diseases in the rich world that also existed in the developing world, if you waited like 20 to 30 years, often as the patents came off, the manufacturing techniques improved, the marginal cost, say of the measles vaccine, got to the point where it's available to everyone. And that really improved life everywhere. I mean, measles was killing over 1 million kids a year, and now that's down a lot, not to zero, because that's a very infectious disease, and lack of belief in vaccines.
That's a whole other question.
Almost, we'll have to deal with that before we can even talk about an eradication there. So in these things, you often get stuck in a high-cost paradigm. In another field, the way we do toilets has to do with putting water in and then taking dirty water out, putting it in a processing facility. That works for rich countries. It will never work for poor countries. So if the solution that the rich countries who do most of the R&D take on doesn't scale down, then there's this awful thing that the innovation might never happen. And that's where government dollars, philanthropic dollars, hopefully can come in and see that's necessary. We also, at some point, people are going to say that the medical costs in the US are taking away so much of society's resources, that government's ability to do other things like education and social services and infrastructure, that we really do need to stop the medical costs going up as a percentage of GDP. And so, if these techniques that work for the developing countries also, with the right incentives, should be encouraged for all of the rich countries, particularly the US is kind of an outlier there. And, so making sure that the barriers for doing these trials and that, the risk money will be there, there still is a societal need that the current structure, doesn't really draw out. But I do see an alignment as people get more serious about US healthcare costs. We went to the UK and proved out that the pneumococcus vaccine, you could do a reduced schedule. Now, we were telling the developing countries they could do a reduced schedule, but they don't like to be told that, because you're so poor, you should do it some inferior way. So we had to get a rich country to go to what's called the 1+1 schedule for that vaccine in order to say, yes, this is the gold standard. It's good enough for UK children, and therefore you should entertain the idea that you, with very limited resources, who, by eliminating one of these doses, you can probably introduce a whole additional vaccine and save, literally hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's very complicated because the rich world, which is the gold standard, the FDA, the trade-offs involved are different in a rich country than they are in a developing country. And trying to make all of that fit together is sometimes very, very tricky.
Yeah. Well, I see we're already running out of time, but you mentioned briefly in passing the vaccine hesitancy issues and how that's, beginning to affect our opportunity to make a difference, eliminating or eradicating a disease that we have a safe, effective, and even cheap vaccine for. This concern about misinformation that's out there about issues, the anti-vax movement, the anti-GMO. I'm sure as you've done your work on gene drive and mosquitoes and malaria, you're getting pushback. How do we address some of these current trends where we're awash in information, some of which is good, some of which is bad? People are using social media to push agendas, and there seems to be in our country and in other countries of the world a growing sort of skepticism about the value of experts and expertise. Just your perspective on that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so there's two different trends that are both concerning. One is that titillating false information is more engaging than true information. Just saying, hey, the MMR vaccine has been proven not to increase rates of autism, people don't click on that like mad. But the idea that, they're out to get you, it's mercury, it's terrible, hear this sad story, that's easier to click on. And so there's that, and then there's this general notion of, hey, if the experts say something, are they somehow biased or naive? GMOs came out at a time when Chernobyl had just happened, mad cow disease was, looking like it could be large numbers, and the benefits at that time were very modest. And the amount of explanation of what was really going on and the safeguards there and how other ways of making seeds with radiation are even worse, that argument didn't succeed. And we don't care about Europe for that. And until we want to do measles eradication, we're not as involved in the ritual vaccination thing. But we get the same type of scares and misinformation in countries where if you drop the vaccination rates, you immediately get tens of thousands of deaths. Not like the US where these diseases aren't prevalent enough, so it's fairly unusual. Like, New York City had a measles outbreak, but it didn't spread too far, and the kids in general were well nourished enough that the number of deaths was, I think, actually zero in that case. There were cases in Europe, both in pertussis and measles, where there actually were deaths. So, is it the case that you have to have deaths before people pay attention to something and go, wow, okay, this is a huge mistake that's being made here. In the case of GMOs, the mistake is that those seeds, they can pay whatever they want for their food, use any approach they want. But for Africa, it will make the difference in terms of the nourishment and dealing with climate change. And so to impose those views on them would block, and even the malaria gene drive thing, fortunately, there was a conference and the Africans came and spoke up and said, look, don't rule this tool out because malaria is a serious thing, and if you want to come see it, please come to Africa. So this is a fight. Will we go through a cycle where it's not as acute as it is today? I don't know. Right at the moment, it doesn't feel that way.
Well, I'm glad you're working on these issues and an important voice on the topic. I know that it's almost time to end. I want to shift gears a bit. I've admired you for a long time for many reasons, and your vision and your leadership. There's one area that maybe some of you don't know about, but he is a voracious reader, and every year he publishes a list of his favorite books, and I always consult that in order to decide what to give my husband for Christmas, and it's always a big success. And you and he actually share enthusiasm for one particular author, Steven Pinker, and I'm told it's true that his book Enlightenment Now is one of your all-time favorites. And I thought, maybe we could end on a very positive note. If you could tell us why you like that book so much.
Well, there are a few people like Steven Pinker and Hans Rosing and a few others who step back and say, look, despite all the things we worry about in terms of politics and acceptance of science and the difficult challenges faced by climate change or controlling the use of various weapon systems, and now we're going to have hypersonic missiles, despite that there's plenty to worry about, and we should worry about those things, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the progress has been absolutely phenomenal. And many people are literally ahistorical to think that in a meaningful sense, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, life was better. And that's just not the case. Yes, there are huge problems, but if you're a woman, if you're gay, if you were subject to certain diseases, if you lived in developing countries, 40 years ago was dramatically worse than it is today. And so if we're going to solve our current problems, having a perspective that yes, we have solved some problems, we're not, and completely changing how we run government, you would feel differently about that if you really examined your progress and said, however imperfect it is, the system largely worked to make that progress. If you think, no, we're just worse off, so let's just roll the dice and try some, utterly untried approach to governance, or, block new science because, some people even think that it's net hasn't been a good thing, you're really losing perspective. And so the good news is if you read these books, they're both very factual, very readable, very educational, and they remind you that great things have happened, that people like Norman Borlaug with the Green Revolution, or Maurice Hellman with vaccines, there's some incredible heroes, and we should look back and regain our optimism despite the fact that particular problems look very, very daunting.
Right. Well, let me end by thanking you for the great things that you have made happen. And I know on behalf of AAAS and everybody here in this crowded auditorium that it's been a wonderful afternoon session with you. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Like, come on, man, you have